I would kindly ask for silence, please. I would kindly ask for silence. We are on time to start. Please, I would ask everyone to take their seats. We are going to immediately start our session devoted to Russia and the West. Again, I would ask those participants that are still entering the room to please be silent. Thank you very much. So we are about to start this very important session on Russia and the West. Let me briefly tell you, even though I guess that the better part of you know me already from many other editions of the Estoril Political Forum, I am currently the ambassador of Portugal to Prague, Czech Republic, having been before the ambassador of Portugal to NATO, to Germany before that, and to other posts. And I have the pleasure today to welcome my friend Jakub Kleppel. He is from the Czech Republic. He is with us online. He is the president of Forum 2000. Forum 2000 Prague is the similar, I would even dare to say, the sister event of our Estoril Political Forum, by far the most prestigious international event that takes place in the Czech Republic. So, Jakub, good morning. It is a pleasure to see you, even though I would prefer, of course, that you would be able to enjoy the good weather of Estoril and not the almost freezing temperatures of our beloved Prague. So, good morning. Thank you very much for being with us today. Also, by video with us on the screen, Christopher Walker from the National Endowment for Democracy. I am going to refrain long presentations of the other host, the chair, the speakers, as you can find all the detailed CVs on the final pages of our program for this session, for this edition of the Estoril Political Forum. Let me start very briefly, before I give the floor to Jakub Kleppel, very briefly to try to set the scene for what we are going to hear and what we are going to discuss today. And the scene setting is in the form of a couple of comments/questions that I am sure our most distinguished speakers will address. Let me start by an obvious assumption. For Russia, for Moscow, for Vladimir Putin, the most important thing is to exert strategic assertiveness. Strategic assertiveness is much more important for the Kremlin than strategic stability, strategic cooperation, strategic predictability. So the name of the game, seen from the Kremlin, is strategic assertiveness, for many reasons that we are all very familiar with. From the West, both from the other side of the Atlantic, as well as in what the NATO alliance is concerned, as well as the European Union is concerned, it is more difficult to discern, to identify a very clear-cut, solid, common approach. And this is a very important part of a big problem, because without unity of purpose, without a very clear definition of political will in a unified way that really encompasses the most important key geostrategic interests that are common to both sides of the North Atlantic Ocean, it will be daunting to successfully face strategic assertiveness. Now, it is also very important to include in this already very complex set scenario, it is very important to include difference or differences of perception. If you ask the public opinion of any of the three Baltic states, simultaneously members of NATO and European Union, or if you ask our Polish friends, what is the clear and present danger in security in a broad definition way, the vast majority of those public opinions will, without any hesitation, say Russia. But if you ask the same question here in Portugal, to you, to the Portuguese public opinion, the answer will be very different. Russia knows that. The Kremlin knows that. And also uses that to divide the West, to divide NATO, to divide the European Union. Because there are really very important differences of perception. I always repeat, half joking, in all my public appearances, that for the Portuguese public opinion, the clear and present danger is still unemployment or the prospect of unemployment. Very different from what the Baltics would tell you. So with these very basic, but with them reflections, but with the expectation that they would set the scene, that they would allow our distinguished guests and speakers to prompt a very interesting and important debate that I will try to moderate to the best of my ability. It is now my pleasure to hand the floor over to my friend Jakub. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, dear Luis. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to join you virtually from Prague. I greet you. Luis, the weather is actually not freezing today. It's actually quite pleasant, but what I think is freezing is the topic we are talking about today. You know, I think there is a renewed freeze in the Russia West relationship, especially if we look at it from the perspective of Central Europe, from Czechia in particular. But let me first, before I go into my very brief remarks at the beginning, thank our colleagues in Estoril, Estoril Political Forum. It's a huge pleasure to co-organize this panel with you. It's also a great pleasure to cooperate with European Partnership for Democracy on this, and it's an honor to join all of the distinguished participants of this panel, who are also some of them very dear friends. On the topic of today, just a quick remark. As I said, the Russia has, and echoing your remarks from the beginning, Luis, Russia, despite being, I would dare to say, a power in a certain decline, and although we are, having together with Russia and also other partners on the international scene many pressing challenges that we would need to face together and we would need to cooperate on. Russia has chosen the path of confrontation, lately, but I think in the longer term, as you call it, strategic assertiveness. Um, from the perspective of the Czech Republic, the most visible recent example of that has been the case of the explosion in the ammunition depot in Verbětice. Some of you may remember the case. The actual explosion actually took place in 2014, but in this spring, it was the details of what happened were actually revealed, and it was disclosed that Russian secret services were directly responsible for the explosion, which was an unprecedented terrorist attack on a territory of a sovereign country, which caused two deathly casualties. So a very serious aggression against a country, against a EU member country, against a NATO member country, and the disclosure of this has led to an escalation of a conflict between Prague and Moscow that essentially concluded in a freeze of relations. The relations were not great before, but these days they are essentially frozen, and there is not much happening on that side. And I think it's illustrative. I mean, we can see to a certain extent a similar development currently going on with NATO, with the tensions and conflict in the Moscow NATO relationships. So I think it needs to be taken seriously, and we all need to see very clearly that we need to take a firm and united stand on Russia, despite the differences that have also been mentioned there in the public opinions, in the different national interests and strategic interests that may different countries of the transatlantic community may have. So we need to find a way how to face Russia jointly, and how to do this in a way that also includes not just the Euro-American partnership over Atlantic, but that also invites other members of the global democratic community to work with us, because we see Russia working not just in the Euro-Atlantic area, but also in Latin America, in Africa, and elsewhere. The nature of that cooperation, the structure of that cooperation, the format of that cooperation is still not very clear, and it not only regards Russia, but it also, of course, regards China and other threats that the democratic community is facing. And these discussions about how this cooperation should be looking were actually part of Forum 2000 conference that took place in Prague last week, and that Luis kindly mentioned in the beginning. So I would just like to call upon all of us to seriously consider these challenges, and to seriously start discussing this global cooperation of democracies, not just on Russia, but on many wider issues that are facing us. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much to Jakub Kleppel for his inspiring remarks, and I would now turn the floor to Christopher Walker from the National Endowment for Democracy. He's also with us via video conference. Christopher Walker, good morning. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for your remarks, and Jakub's as well. It's really a pleasure to be with everyone from afar on this very important topic. And I might just say, by way of introducing the panel, we'll get into it in just a moment, building on the remarks that both the ambassador and Jakub made. I think the episode in Verbětice that occurred in the Czech Republic was so outrageous when you think about it, but in a way it was enabled by the West's lack of response preceding that action and creating some boundaries for the relationship. So I think it's fair to say that the Russian authorities, which don't feel as though they are checked either internally or externally, are behaving accordingly. And we see this through the projection of kleptocracy from the country. We see this from the projection of disinformation. Jakub alluded to the fact that this is now something that's really evolved in places like Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa, in addition to North America and all parts of Europe. And the Russian authorities have also seen fit to engage in a competition of norms and ideas, which I think the community of democracies simply haven't been prepared for. And then finally, the ambassador said something I thought was terribly important, which is there's a lack of political literacy about the Russian authorities and their foreign policy in so many places. And this is something, it's a gap that needs to be filled. The ambitions and the objectives of the Russian authorities need to be understood far better by parts of the world, I would suggest in Southern Europe, including Portugal, in ways that haven't been the case to date. And so for those reasons, I'm particularly happy we have such a terrific panel. I'm not going to introduce them. I'm just going to provide their affiliations, and then we'll jump right into the discussion. Each of the speakers will speak for just a few minutes. We'll try to squeeze as much time, as much out of the discussion as we can in the short time we have allotted, but I think this will be a very important discussion. So first, we'll hear from Dora Geoffrey, who's from the Pázmány Péter Catholic University in Budapest, then from Ked Godfrey of the European Partnership for Democracy based in Brussels. We'll then hear from Konstantin von Egert, who's with Deutsche Welle in Bonn in Germany, and then Maria Sniegovaya from the George Washington University here in Washington, and then Zdzisław Mach, who's the former dean of the Faculty of International and Political Studies at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And so with that, I'm very pleased to hand it over to Dora, and I'd just like to take this opportunity for myself to thank the team at the Estoril Political Forum, with whom we have such a great ongoing relationship here at the International Forum for Political Studies, and I hope to see you there next year. So why don't we turn it over to Dora now?
Okay, thank you. I'm delighted to be here again in person. Last year, it was just the work of writing my speech without the fun of being in Estoril. Thank you, Professor Espada, for inviting me again. I love being in Portugal because things feel so normal here, unlike the place I come from. So, to the issue at hand. Relations between Russia and the West are at their lowest point for decades. As a recent report by the Atlantic Council puts it, it is hard to have amicable relations with a country which is, and I quote, a stagnating authoritarian kleptocracy led by a president for life who has started wars against its neighbors, assassinates opponents inside and outside of Russia, interferes in US and European elections, and generally seems to act as an anti-US spoiler at every opportunity. End of quote. We can add to this list the weaponization of energy and the support of autocrats around the world, from Venezuela to Syria and Belarus. Still, Russia seems less dangerous than China. It was also mentioned by Karl Gershman yesterday. And there is a constant fear that by stepping up, the West pushes the two countries ever closer together. This raises the question, how to counter the threats posed by Russia without pushing it further towards China. To analyze this question, first we should understand the internal problems in Russia. The Western financial sanctions imposed for Russia's actions against Ukraine have been successful in stopping Putin to move further into Ukraine and slowing economic growth, which has been 0.3% per year since 2014. As a result, most of the population is facing a declining standard of living, which stands in sharp contrast to the extreme wealth accumulated by Putin and his cronies. This is a system of power and ownership, where ownership is defended by political power and political power decides ownership. The resource-based economy of Russia was particularly liable to the creation of a strong patronal network after Putin raided Yukos oil company and seized regional governance tax revenues from the country's resource companies in 2003-2004. While periods of higher oil and gas prices allowed Putin to distribute various rents to the general population as wages and pensions, sanctions, slow economic growth, and low oil prices constrain such policies and have led to growing dissatisfaction within the population. Initially, victories in small wars, especially the illegal annexation of the Crimea, boosted Putin's popularity, but by now, the Russian public have grown tired of this tactic. Russia's system hardly inspires followers or admirers voluntarily, so it tries to win respect in the international system by force, often acting as a spoiler in international relations. It expects international acceptance for its own sphere of influence. And while it is eager to interfere into elections abroad, it rejects any interference into its own domestic affairs. So what can the West do? The West has basically three options. The first one is a non-starter. The West cannot change Russia overnight. Recent fiascos in much weaker countries, such as Afghanistan, illustrate the limits of externally enforced change. Sanctions can work in this direction, but as we can see in the Russian case, their impact can be evaluated only in the longer term. We should also recognize that the Russian system has become highly resilient to externally imposed changes. The Kremlin has been strengthening its defenses against external intervention since the color revolutions of the 2000s. Development of the sovereign internet, the RUNET, and the massive crackdown of the opposition ahead of the fraudulent Duma elections are the newest bricks in this already thick wall. Appeasement is the second option. It would imply the accommodation of Russian, or more precisely, Putin's interest, including respecting its authoritarian system. Over the past 2 decades, there have been several efforts to appease Russia and reset the relationship with the West. The US tried it 3 times since 2000, but it didn't work. Bush's reset was ended in 2008 by the invasion of Georgia, while Crimea proved to be the end of Obama's reset policy in 2014. As we know, Trump succeeded in having good personal relationship with Putin, but his motives were highly suspect, even to his own administration officials. As one of Putin's arch enemies, Bill Browder, puts it, it is a kind of arrogance from new incoming Western leaders, and I quote, saying, well, you know, my predecessor really didn't know how to deal with this, but I know how to deal with him, and I'm going to charm him, or I'm going to reset the relations and make things right. And time and again, Putin ends up laughing at them, end of quote. This underlines the fact that appeasement works only if the other side is ready to get appeased. However, the present Russian leadership is not pursuing good relations with the West anymore. They are unwilling to make any concessions for the sake of improving ties with the West. This means that even if the West makes some concessions, it is highly unlikely that Russia would reciprocate. Instead, Moscow would probably see it as another sign of Western weakness and would try to exploit it. There is, however, a third option, strengthening the immune system of the West and reducing vulnerabilities to Russian malign influence. How can we do this? In its various efforts of disruption, Russia builds strongly on Western weaknesses and failures to live up to its own ideals. The first major issue is the fight against corruption and money laundering. In the West, there is a tendency to focus on petty corruption, which exists everywhere to various extent, and involves the exchange of bribe money among willing actors. In Russia, we have a very different type of corruption, which involves large-scale, high-value transactions by governmental actors. This is systemic or grand corruption conducted by a criminal state. Here, actors pay protection money, which is extorted by state officials. Due to the kleptocratic system, more billionaires live in Moscow than anywhere else in Europe, including London, where Russian billionaires are also overrepresented. To keep their wealth safe and away from public view, billionaires and even Putin himself rely on the Western financial system. A conservative estimate of Russian private money being held abroad is $1 trillion. This is used to buy Western assets, but also to finance political actors, most often populist parties, who can guarantee that this wealth is safe. By accepting this money, the West becomes complicit in the crimes of the Russian regime. Rejecting profits from illicit assets is testing the adherence of the West to its own ideals. In this case, pragmatism means appeasing dictators and allowing our own system to rot. Corruption is a self-reinforcing cycle where illicit financing of anti-establishment actors helps to undermine democracy, which breeds more corruption and more degeneration of the political system. Ultimately, it is our own weaknesses rather than Russian strength which leads to decline. Increasing transparency and accountability of the Western financial systems, taking money laundering seriously, widespread asset freezing of Putin and his cronies is an obvious starting point to fight malign, corrupting Russian influence. I find it very encouraging that fighting corruption and money laundering was included into the new Atlantic Charter. Fighting disinformation and the clouding of our information space is also critical. Russia's Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, wrote in 2013, and I quote, "The role of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals has grown, and in many cases they have exceeded the power of force of weapons in their effectiveness," end of quote. Propaganda, fake news, and digital social engineering are the new triad of disruption, as recently theorized by James Curtis. They are low-cost, highly effective measures for Russia to sow the seeds of discord in Western societies. Information war tools are most effective when people are unsuspecting, and thus educating society from primary school to adulthood about this phenomenon is a crucial element of defense. Insisting on the existence of truth and facts, as revealed through open exchange and dialogue, and not allowing the blurring of truth by hostile actors can significantly weaken Russian efforts. Improving the quality of our education systems is also critical in strengthening the center and addressing social polarization, which is exploited by Russian influence operations. There are also divides within the Western alliance. Poland and Hungary insist on constitutional sovereignty, which undermines a unified understanding of the rule of law in the European Union. While Poland fights mostly an ideological battle, in Hungary such rhetoric tends to cover a system which is becoming increasingly like Putin's Russia. In this case, the role of natural resources was played by European funds. Tackling corruption and taking the rule of law mechanism seriously are key factors in stopping the growing divide within the European Union, which make it difficult to act in a unified manner in areas of foreign policy. So what about China? Since Putin's key concern is sustaining his authoritarian system, the West has few means to distance these two countries. However, in many ways, the threats posed by China are very similar to challenges from Russia. The West does not have the power to change China. It has tried it from the 1990s, but instead of transforming the country into a more democratic system, it assisted in building up a strong authoritarian rival. For a long time, instead of recognizing the threat, the West have been, and some still is, lured by voices of pragmatism. The hope that focusing on business interests and mutual profit opportunities while tolerating authoritarianism might work out for both parties. But in the long term, only China wins as the West gives up its own ideals and lets its technology stolen. China is using very similar methods to Russia to undermine the West. Corruption via the Belt and Road Initiative, disinformation campaign in social media, but also via Confucius Institutes, and fracturing the alliance through buying up corrupt politicians. Fighting against these dangers and strengthening the immune system of the West should be an essential part of the strategy against both hostile powers. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dora. And I think your point relating to strategic corruption and the West's complicity is a terribly important aspect of what you've just described to us. Let me turn now to Ken Godfrey, and we'll hear from him.
Before we do, let me only ask you please to be, all of you, as disciplined as I was in what the time that is allotted to each one of you is concerned. Otherwise, we would have no time at the end of our session for a debate. There is for sure a lot of questions that our audience would like to raise, addressed to our speakers and the other members of this session. So please, Ken Godfrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you, Chris, for the introduction. Well noted. I will try to be as brief and concise as possible. say thank you, of course, to the organizers, IEP, for inviting me here and for co-organizing this panel with Forum 2000. I very much regret that I'm not there. Also regret that I was unable to be in Prague as well, but I hope to be at both next year. On the topic of freezing, I think it's the big issue, which I sit in Brussels, the big issue at European level right now are gas prices. And here on Thursday and Friday, literally opposite the office that I sit in, this issue will be discussed and Russia will be top of the agenda. Now, I think people know over 40% of gas imports to the European Union come from Russia. And there have been accusations of the Russian Federation that it is using gas prices to put pressure on the European Union and European Union member states. I think we can all agree that that is probably the case. And what's more, the IEA has come out saying that the Russian government could increase the number of gas imports to the European Union. Yesterday, the High Representative of the European Union, Josep Borrell, said that he thought there were deep geopolitical roots to this, the issue of high gas prices in the European Union. And this is a dicey game on the Russian side. They're trying to put pressure in terms of the energy transition within the European Union. It could backfire. It could lead to European governments deciding that they need to plow ahead, double down on the energy transition in order to be less reliant on Russian gas imports. And I can only second exactly what Dora said, that lots of these things are related to the very nature of the Russian regime. And I think we also need to look internally. So what I'd like to do is just first cover Russia very quickly, as I've just done now, and then look internally as a European Union. I'm based in Brussels. That's my area of expertise. So I will focus on that for the next 5 minutes. With regards to Russia, there were the elections in September. What I would say is that there are obviously internal concerns on the part of the Russian elite as to the stability of the system. I think those concerns have increased in recent years, and they are the reason for such a clampdown now on many of the activists and those working, I think, very effectively to push for transparency and accountability within the country. Russia's also sought to undermine international organizations. NATO, we saw NATO yesterday, the Russian announcement with regards to the liaison office. But more importantly, I think, with regards to Russian membership of different organizations, is the undermining of the work of the Council of Europe as well as the OSCE. The Swedish government has had real trouble in its chairpersonship of the OSCE this year to really get anything moving, particularly with regards to involvement of civil society, but also a conflict in the region. If I focus on also the area around the European Union, there's also increased tension between the Russian Federation and European member states, Western Balkans, Eastern Mediterranean, Eastern Europe. Now, even in the Sahel, there were accusations of the European Union of the Malign government now recruiting the Wagner group for security reasons in Mali. It's just another example of the tension between the Russian Federation and the European Union. If I turn now to the European Union, the big story, let's say, in the last 6 months is the fact also that the German and French governments sought to have a summit with the Russian Federation in June. This was blocked by other EU member states in the Council, basically backfired on the French and German governments. It's no secret that the French government, that Macron would like more strategic dialogue with the Russian government. And on the German side, I think it's too early to say with regards to the elections, the different variations of coalitions, but there's no coalition that will not include either the SPD or the CDU, CSU. And for that reason, I think it's unlikely that we would see a sea change in German foreign policy with regards to the Russian Federation. There will be a prioritization of bilateral economic relationship, including within the energy sphere. So there, I mean, I think the Greens and the FDP will have an impact, but it will not be major. I'd be interested to hear what others think about that. I'd like to conclude by focusing on exactly what Dora said, are looking internally. And there's a confluence of two issues which I think are very important. The first of those is regulation in the digital sphere. and the difficulty with which the transatlantic, at least, alliance is dealing with regulation in the digital sphere. It is a difficult issue that was made clear in Pittsburgh at the Council of Trade and Technology, but it is a very important issue with regards to dealing with the challenges in the digital sphere. And secondly, is a important trend with regards to Russian involvement in democracies, and that is the desire of the Russian government to point out apparent double standards in the way that Western governments operate. Now here, this use of double standards has also been employed very effectively by the government of Viktor Orban. Today, or yesterday, the Polish government also used the accusations of double standards with regards to rule of law in the European Union by referencing the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe with regards to their own desire to essentially undermine the legal framework of the European Union with the ruling last week. And to me, there's an interesting link between those two. And the reason I say this is that the Russian government has been incredibly effective at saying that whatever is done by Western governments within the Russian Federation is seen as fine, and whatever the Russian government does in Western countries is seen as malign interference. I'll give you an example. The election interference in so many Western democracies is well known on the part of the Russian government. In the Russian elections in September, the Russian government accused the US of also trying to interfere in Russian elections. This is straight out of the classic playbook of the Russian government. And I think that there are two key differences in terms of this interference or involvement. One is the transparency on behalf of the Western countries when they engage in this type of support to democratic activists or political parties in different countries. The Russian government also supports political parties within the European Union, but does it through shell companies and non-beneficial ownership. At the same time, there is a difference of intent in terms of the engagement of Western governments in the democratic development of different countries around the world, and the involvement of the Russian government in European democracies. And that is that the European governments are focusing very clearly on norms at the international level that are agreed to at UN level. Why is this important? This is important because in the digital sphere, we've already seen recently the government of Singapore start a process for combating disinformation that gives incredibly big powers to the government. And I am worried, and I think there are many that are worried, that in the response to the challenges in the digital sphere, Western democracies will play into the hands of autocratic regimes by over-regulating this space. There is a need for regulation, and there are three things that regulation must tackle. The first of those is to allow encryption. There can be no bans on encryption. Encryption must be allowed. This is important for privacy in democracies. The second is a push for transparency. Transparency of advertising in the digital space and transparency of algorithms in the digital space. And the final one is a ban on mass surveillance. And the ban on mass surveillance technologies is very important, and there is a clear distinction here between the governments of in the European Union and those in the North America. Now, the reason that I'm saying this, it might seem something that's not on the radar at the moment, but there is a lot of movement now in the digital sphere in terms of regulation. And we need to be very clear that this is it. We must look internally, as Dora has just said, to try to combat the challenges in the digital sphere, but not play into the hands of autocrats who would like to see us give too much power to government and become arbiters of truth. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I very much look forward to hearing from others on the panel.
So thank you very much, Ken, for those remarks. And I think your observation on how open societies can deal with what are effectively modern forms of whataboutism on these normative questions is terribly important. And I suspect we're not so good at that right now in terms of clarifying for wider audiences the important distinctions between the approaches of these authoritarian governments in these domains compared with open societies. So let me turn now to Konstantin von Egert, and we'll hear from him, and then we'll move on to Maria.
Thank you very much, Chris. A very good afternoon to you all. Two qualifications before I speak. In spite of what my name may seem, I'm a fourth generation born and raised Muscovite in a family of mixed Polish, German, Lithuanian, and Swedish and Russian origin. A second qualification, although I do contribute to Deutsche Welle and I do write about Russian politics and policies, I don't speak for Deutsche Welle. I'm a contractor rather than a staff member. After these qualifications, I wanted to say that basically, to use Woodrow Wilson's phrase, I have nothing more to add after my distinguished colleagues, but I will try. I'd like to go back to what Ambassador Sampaio said at the beginning, and that is that the way Moscow and the Putin regime look from Warsaw, Vilnius, Riga, or Prague is totally different from the way you here in Portugal look at it. The recent incident with the mayor of Lisbon office giving names of anti-Putin and anti-Xi protesters to the respectively Russian and Chinese embassies is a great example of this case. Well, Russia seems to be, to use Neville Chamberlain's words now, in a Churchillian setting, of course, that's very appropriate. Russia seems to be, for many, especially in Southern Europe, a faraway country we know little about. Or, even more so, a country that may be quite useful. To add to what Dora and other distinguished participants said, I would like to stress a few things about the nature of the current Russian government that I think should put things into context. First and foremost of all, we are dealing with a regime which is headed essentially by a president for life. Last year, in a plebiscite that was pretty much rigged, Mr. Putin gave himself the right to be, quote-unquote, re-elected for another 2 6-year terms after his own term expires, current term expires in 2024. That takes it to 2036 when he'll be 84. That means that although the transition is not at all ensured, there is more space now for the Kremlin to do what it does best. And that is very important too, and that's my number 2 point. Sometimes Russian policies, the Kremlin's policies, I would like to say rather, are described in purely geopolitical terms, with all these references to, you know, recreating the glory of the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. No, Putin doesn't want to recreate the Soviet Union. What is important is that this divisiveness, that strategic assertiveness that Ambassador Sampaio referred to, is very much a double-edged sword. It's something that cuts both ways for Putin. On the one hand, it is definitely seen by the Kremlin as a security insurance for the regime domestically, because essentially this is a regime of survivalists. It is a regime that is concerned about its own preservation. And one of the ways to preserve it is seen not only in increasing domestic repression, as we've seen recently with the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny, another name that should be mentioned in this audience, and the crackdown on Russian civic society and the media. But it is also important for the Kremlin to increase instability and divide the West, essentially, because then the weak West will not be able to pressure Moscow into conforming to international law and international norms of international behavior. And domestic behavior, too. That's very important. And secondly, what's also important is that this same policy is seen by Vladimir Putin as his own personal historical legacy that he's going to leave to whoever's going to continue to continue in his place after he eventually leaves the Kremlin. And this legacy is seen, I think, by Putin, and now we know from his numerous speeches and articles, as essentially creating a new Russian civic identity, which has nothing to do with democracy, which has nothing to do, to some extent, with the Soviet Union, but an identity in which obedience to the powers that be, in being ready to sacrifice one's well-being and, if need be, life, to the orders of whoever sits in the Kremlin. This country where greatness is everything and everything else is nothing, that is an important vision of Russia that I think the current government espouses, and which is being promoted by the education system and by different aspects of Russian policy. Thirdly, I think that it's very important to understand that without perpetuating conflicts, this particular government, this particular political system will not feel stable domestically. That is why, ever since 2014 and the start of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, the aim of the government propaganda, the aim of all the political actions by the Kremlin was to ensure that Russia exists in this, what I would call a besieged fortress mentality, in which the garrison is the Russian people, and the commandant's name, the fortress's commandant's name we know, it's Vladimir, and basically everyone has to follow the commandant's orders because Russia is besieged by this perfidious, aggressive West. This is something that, by the way, goes down, well, or used to go down fairly well with the Russian population for one simple reason. Russians do not travel much. People you see here belong to a minority of probably 20–25% of the population, maybe 30 max, that have passports. Many people, and that traveled a lot across Russia, have never been abroad, have never been to Moscow or St. Petersburg. For them, the West is a concept which is pretty much alien, unknown, or whatever the government tells these people it is. So in a sense, I think the Kremlin is benefiting a lot from this vast country, which is not very rich, and a lot of people there don't even know much about the outside world, apart from the very big cities, of course. Now, another, probably last point. Someone noticed, I think it was Dora, that it's a fairly stable regime. Well, yes, to some extent it is, but I think that it is stable because it's been learning from the mistakes of the Soviet Union. In the days of Brezhnev, which I remember quite well, there were two things that people were irritated about. It was empty shop shelves, lack of everything, and the fact that the society was completely closed. Basically, all the dissidents were kept inside the Soviet Union. Eventually, this pressure cooker blew up in the 1980s, and we know the result. Now, what happens today is different. Exporting oil and gas means that you will keep, the Kremlin can keep the economy going, so basically the shop shelves will be full, give or take, depending, of course, on your salary. But they will be more or less full for you. You will not stand in queues to buy macaroni. And another important thing is that essentially the Kremlin encourages immigration of anyone who wants to. You want to go. The world is big. And then you can sit in Santiago de Chile or Lisbon or Sydney and write your blogs about Putin the dictator. They wouldn't care about that. So in a sense, that means that a significant part of economically and politically active society is gradually seeping out of Russia. Final point. I still think that there are certain things that work against the current government. And I mean, basically, in order for Russia not to collapse, I'd like it to take notice of it. First and foremost of all, Russia hasn't seen an economic growth since the crisis of 2008. there is no political system in which consistent, if gradual, drop in living standards didn't lead to political changes. That's number one. Number two, I think the risky policies and, let's face it, the not-so-frozen war with Ukraine is something that can lead to strategic mistakes by the Kremlin, which will maybe provoke internal and external shocks to the system. And thirdly, I think, and that is really the last point, there is one big enemy that the current leadership faces. This enemy is called time. These people have been around for 20 plus years and counting. Human mind is such that it wants diversity eventually. It wants change. So when you see the same faces aging on television and telling you the same things they told you 10, 15 years ago, that provokes thinking. We already have a generation that grew up, was born, grew up, and now probably started families under one leader. That's Vladimir Putin. I think that this is something that needs to be taken into account because this breeds resentment, gradually breeds resentment, and that makes the situation eventually unpredictable. So it's a bit like since we're in a Catholic university, it's a bit like waiting for the second coming of Christ. You have to be vigilant every second. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to thank Konstantin for those cogent remarks. And now let's turn it to Maria.
Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a big honor to be with you today. I'm sorry that it's not happening in person. On the downside, on the upside, I get the pleasure to admire the beautiful DC sunrise as while listening to the participants. Now, a lot of my points echo a lot of what has already been said by the esteemed panelists here. So I will try a little bit elaborate on some of the points, and I think especially what is changing in Russia and why we should care, and what can be done based on the changes and developments that have been outlined. As we speak, another recent development that you might have heard of has different kind of highlights how bad the relationship between the West and Russia have become based on Moscow's yesterday's decision to end its diplomatic mission to the NATO. Essentially, fairly symbolic mission given everything else that's going on, but nonetheless significant development indicating the continuing worsening of their relationship. Despite this trend, which has been ongoing for quite a while, unfortunately, we still here and there have European Western policymakers, politicians who come to power and announce the need to reset the relationship with Russia. The French president, for example, came to power with similar ideas. Now, as it has been pointed out by other participants, I wanted to stress that unfortunately, any reset of relationship with current Russian leadership is unlikely. Russia, first of all, and it's really not the problem that lies with the West. The reasons for that, as I argue, are how the Russian leadership views the West. They have to do with much deeper seated reasoning and self-interest, interested logic of the Russian elite. Well, first of all, of course, that's not hardly a new point. Russia is led by political leaders with very specific views, many of them which have been formed throughout the Soviet times. And the KGB at the time was specifically trained with those ideas that the West is out there to get Russia and to essentially make it collapse. That is, of course, when we speak about the West, specifically with regards to the United States, but the European Union is also seen as sort of, being within the same transatlantic alliances conspiracy to destroy Russia. Even the Dulles plan, as ridiculous as it sounds, the conspiracy has been actually known to be used in the training of the Russian KGB. Now, that should be kept in mind when you try to interpret some of the things that Russian president, for example, says. Those deeply ingrained beliefs that he received throughout his training as a KGB officer, unfortunately, are there to stay. Second, on top of those considerations and generally seeing the West as hostile, and by the way, observers who saw Vladimir Putin early on throughout his years in St. Petersburg administration, way before he became the president, they do report that back then he already expressed a lot of anti-Western sentiment throughout the negotiation with Western partners. So that's hardly a new development, and that's unlikely to change at this point, now that he's with us to stay, as Konstantin Egert has pointed out. The second point is the Russian leadership understands that being friendly with the West eventually would imply a push for elite rotation on Russia, on top of Russia. The West eventually will try to promote and push for more democracy in Russia. And that clashes fundamentally with the long-term orientations and interests of the Russian elite. At this point, we can quite safely claim that the Russian elites are primarily interested in survival in power and stay into power whatever it takes. I mean, nobody is really surprised, right, by the new unprecedented crackdown and repressive wave unraveling in Russia as we speak, which is again ultimately meant to eliminate any possible long-term risks for Putin and his closest elites in their staying in power. With that in mind, the West and the friendship with the West is seen as a fundamental challenge, fundamentally hostile to the Russian elite's ability to maintain the hold on power. By contrast, the same logic justifies the longer-term partnership with China, because the Russian elites understand that their survival in power is conditional on being friendly with China and having and being backed by Chinese authorities who care much less about human rights, democracy, elite rotation, and whatnot. Therefore, once again, the key takeaway is that breaking Russia-China alliance in the near future by trying to pull back Russia into the Western kind of partnership, friendship, is often pointed out even by some policymakers in the US administration, Biden's administration, that is unlikely, unfortunately, to be a successful strategy. The Russian elites see the situation fundamentally different once again. So that leads us to conclude, unfortunately, that whatever the Western leadership does and whatever concessions the leaders in the West make, which has been pointed out by the other panelists, often is viewed as a weakness by the Kremlin elites, that is unlikely to change the longer-term orientation of the Kremlin. That is directed, again, towards the conflict with the West, even if its conflict is likely to be maybe non-linear, right? The war is Cold War. I know some people don't like this comparison, but nonetheless, the idea is that there will be a hostile vision of the West by the Kremlin, and there will be continuing effort to undermine the transatlantic alliance that is viewed by the Kremlins as being fundamentally hostile to the Kremlin's long-term goals. And I think at this point, the European leadership, the American leadership, should stop blaming itself for the status quo and for unfortunate development and the current Russian-Western relationship, because unfortunately that has more to do with the Kremlin elite's orientation, that whatever policies the West passes in order to mitigate this conflict. Now, when it comes to the bad news, that's the bad news. Unfortunately, the long-term conflict, the long-term hostility of the Kremlin against the West is here to stay as long as the current elites are in power, as Konstantin Egert has pointed out. We're at this point less reliant on political science when it comes to predicting the longevity of the Russian regime, and more relying on medical science because Vladimir Putin is with us to stay probably as long as he lives. The good news, however, there is a good news, and that good news, again, following up with what Konstantin has said, has a lot to do with the changing attitudes of the Russian population. The Russian population actually differs quite dramatically in its attitudes from the Russian elites, and often not given credit where the credit is due. I mean, granted, there's little credit, but there is still some that should be given. First of all, According to the polls, and for example, here I rely on this study that has been run by famous political scientists William Zimmerman and Ron Inglehart, based on the survey of the Russian elites that's ongoing for 20 years. Actually, Russian elites are more anti-Western in their orientations and attitudes than the Russian population. And the Russian elites started to be more anti-Western earlier than the Russian population, and in a lot of way, they drew the spread of the anti-Western sentiment across the Russian masses, while the Russian masses actually are responding and following the propaganda, rather than essentially this anti-Western sentiment in Russia, rather than it's being driven from some deeply seated Russian anti-Westernism. So Russian elites are the ones who are driving these trends, and on average, Russian elites are more anti-Western than the Russian masses are. Second, despite the effort of the Russian elites again to create this anti-Western sentiment among the Russians through these propaganda channels, you can, looking at the polls today, we can argue that the effort is not very successful. As a matter of fact, recently there was a significant improvement in the attitudes towards the West among the Russian elites, and actually there's a growing demand to improve for renegotiation of the relationship among the Russians. In my research, I show that actually that is at least partly linked to worsening economic situation, and Russian masses, the population, are quite rational. They understand that improving the relationship with the West also will mean improving economic situation, most likely because of the sanction. So there is an extent to, there's a limit to which the Russian elites can essentially force compliance among the Russian population with the foreign policy that they're imposing on them. And in recent years, there is growing demand for better relationship with the West. Third, the Kremlin is also losing grip on the Russian population when it comes to spreading propaganda. Because, of course, as you know, the internet penetration is spreading, the use and reliance on internet is spreading, and the Russians are less susceptible to the Kremlin propaganda that's primarily promoted by the state-owned TV channels. This trend are especially pronounced among the Russian future, the younger generations, and I'm talking here among the younger Russians aged maybe below 35, who are at this point quite the opposite of the older Russian age cohorts on pretty much most of the domestic and foreign policy issue dimensions when it comes to the attitudes towards the West, attitudes towards, say, sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, tolerance, and whatnot. So Russia's future is not with where the current Kremlin foreign policy is taking it. Unfortunately, the younger Russians are also a minority of the Russian population, and so it will take time for them to be able to really influence policy in Russia in any meaningful way. So these are all developments within the Russian society that actually clash with the longer term orientation of the Kremlin foreign policy. And in the next decade, I think we'll witness these clashes actually becoming more pronounced domestically. For us, in terms of the takeaways, and here I'm going to be concluding already with my presentation, what does it mean? Well, first of all, as I said before, the demand for improving the relationship with the West within the Russian population is associated to perceived worsening of the economic situation in Russia and spreading perception that the Kremlin, the Russian elites, are not taking the country in the right direction. If you look at the polls, you'll notice that growing amount of Russia actually sees the situation as not being good for Russia. They don't see the future. What it means is that sanctions actually are effective to the extent that they contribute to the economic stagnation in the country. And the longer they stay in place, the more effective they're likely to become. The European Union, I think, should get credit for showing remarkable commitment to the sanction and being able to maintain the sanctions policy for quite a while. However, there are significant areas where the situation can be improved. First of all, the existing individual level sanctions absolutely should be combined with the freezing of these individual assets that are like located in the West.
Maria, I hate to do this, but you need to conclude. I'm sorry,
I'm
we will
concluding.
need to finish at 1 p.m. and we have still one speaker left. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so now we're going to hear from Zdzisław Mach. I know we're at the end of our time. I'm going to hand things over to Jakub Kleppel as I need to leave, but this has been a wonderful discussion. Over to you.
Well, okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not easy to be the last speaker before lunch, but as you know, but still, you know, I have 3 minutes. I will try to use them all. I'm really delighted to be here again, and I must congratulate Professor Espada and his team for being able to do it, and of course, in spite of pandemics, the atmosphere and the spirit is still as excellent as always. My own, a few reflections really, a few remarks which I want to make on this issue of Russia and the West. Is slightly different perspective because as a sociologist and as a Europeanist, I'm going to speak mainly about relation between Russia and Europe, and from the point of view not so much of politics, we've heard a lot about this so far, but perhaps identity, perception, images, and whatever comes out of this. So perhaps it is appropriate to say at the beginning that Russia and Europe need each other from the point of view of identity formation. They need each other as a frame of reference, as important points of reference. They, in this sense, Russia uses Europe to build its identity, and of course Europe is also building its own collective identity and its need of integration, has been pointed out already, in many ways, having Russia at the point of reference. For Russia, Russia is a big brother for its Eastern European neighbors, former satellites, and a significant other for Europe. As such, for the whole of Europe, but also individually, especially for some European states, specifically Germany and France. For many years, during the Cold War, of course, Russia was a superpower. Then it largely lost its global position, and perhaps most importantly, its dignity and pride, which really was very important factor in what was happening internally in Russia. Putin has a reputation because he restored pride and dignity, and I think is an important source of his popularity among many Russians. For President Putin, as I said, the EU is a significant other and a competitor. And his aim, as probably many of us would agree, is to weaken Europe, is to divide Europe, the European Union especially. He builds his relations with individual member states, preferably, especially with those which he respects, like Germany, of course, economic relations, while at the same time he tends to treat his former satellites collectively and individually as only half European. Of course, using also any problems which we notice in Central Eastern Europe. When I would say that what is currently happening in Poland and in Hungary, their conflict with the EU over many things, especially values and rule of law, is exactly what Putin wants. Dividing and weakening the EU. So in Poland, the opposition says after one of the many new legislations or any political maneuvers by the government, say that Putin is opening a bottle of champagne on Kremlin. I don't know whether he actually does it, but he would have good reasons to do it. I would say that between Russia and its European significant others, there is kind of mutual fascination. on the level of culture also. France especially is seen as having a wonderful culture by Russians. I mean, we see it in Tolstoy, we see it in Russian immigration, but also mutually. And it's enough to remember what Sartre thought about Russia in its worst Stalinist period, as when he saw the enthusiasm and optimism in opposition to his own existential pessimism. Historically, it's also important, I think, to remember that there exists an ideology and a concept of pan-Slavism in Russia. This is a concept that great Slavic people and Slavic cultures should unite, should integrate, of course, under the obvious natural leadership of Russia. Such an idea, of course, is met with mixed reaction in smaller than Russia Slavic countries, because, of course, it is connected with the fear of Russian domination, but also, especially in some countries, Poland here is a very good example. After the Bolshevik Revolution and the Second World War, this fascination of the greatness of Russian culture is also counterbalanced by a certain image according to which Russia is a barbaric country with all this Red Army representing the culturally an extremely low level, which of course was then subject of jokes and anecdotes, and this is one of the components of the image which Russia has. I don't think it is possible to understand Russia today without remembering the importance of what they call a Great Patriotic War. The Second World War, which of course costed millions of lives, and I think because of the importance of it, Russia feels now, or many Russians feel bitter or feel disappointed that those the people, population, societies which were liberated from the Nazi occupation by the Red Army are now turning their back to Russia and were happily embraced by the West. There is this symbolism of Russian blood that's soaked in the soil and making the soil sacred and really symbolically Russian. I have to finish, so one more issue still to mention. Politically, Putin obviously dreams of regaining the position of Russia as a global superpower, but he doesn't obviously want to join the family of liberal democracies. Instead, he probably thinks the liberal democracy is weak and indecisive. Therefore, he positions himself as a leader of an alternative integration of illiberal democracies based entirely on the rule of the majority without the liberal checks and balances. And if you think about it, countries like Turkey, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Hungary tend to be, each of them in a different way, but are fascinated by this concept of illiberal democracy, which does have the support of the majority, but nothing else that we here understand as democracy in its only possible version, which is the liberal version. I think this concept is not entirely unattractive to many leaders of the region of Central Eastern Europe, and I think in the name of unity of Western democracies, we should actually pay a lot of attention to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much all for this fascinating debate. The first takeaway is very obvious. Next time we will discuss Russia at the Estoril Political Forum. Instead of 1 hour and 15 minutes, we would need 2 hours and 30 minutes at the least. And I am sorry especially to my friend Maria for cutting her speech short, but we really need to be in the boundaries of the established time frame. A more assertive Russia, with a keen interest in projecting their strategic ambitions, needs, of course, from the West side, the projection of strategic stability. We will need more predictability, better risk reduction, especially in the face of a Russia that is perceived more and more with fighting with a dire economic situation, diminishing demographic perspective, and also with a not so good overall global health situation for their population. So a lot of interesting takeaways, important conclusions. We are not going to have time for the debate. Let me, before we close this session, to make a practical announcement. The ceremony of handover of the prize Faith and Freedom to Professor Jorge Miranda will have to be postponed due to reasons pertaining to Professor Jorge Miranda health. So it will be postponed, and the new time and date will be fixed as soon as possible by the organizers of the Estoril Political Forum. So without any further ado, thanking very much all the participants and the imposing audience that we have in front of us, and wishing you all excellent continuation of the proceedings of the Estoril Political Forum. Thank you.